Chapter 11. Ellie's world spun as the boy's boot caught her in the eyebrow. Afraid that the next swing of the blade might bring her death, Ellie jabbed fearfully at the boy. Her wand was in her hand, clutched tightly, and she aimed its point at the violent boy's stomach. The result was far more spectacular than she could have imagined. Instead of the boy being mildly discomforted by a twig-like bone being poked at him by a puny 10-year-old girl, the muscular teenage boy was struck by lightning. But the lightning did not come from the sky. It came from Ellie, through the wand. It bridged the space to the next boy, launching both boys into the air with screams. The remaining 3 boys, 2 with goblins perched on their shoulders and giving orders, came to a confused halt. Their confident rampage was brought to an abrupt end as they stood unsure of what to do. The boys looked worriedly to the 2 goblins, who looked from her to each other in shock. From the corner of her vision, which began to turn pink as blood ran into one of her eyes, Ellie saw Rake crumpled on the floor. She felt anger building up at the goblins and their brainwashed warrior boys. One of the goblins screeched something at the lone boy, and instantly, with a look of fear on his face, he raised his sword and leapt towards Ellie in an attack. Without thought, Ellie's wand came up in response. From the wand she felt a powerful burst of air explode before her, a shockwave that swept towards her enemies. The attacking boy was smashed from his feet, his sword flying free of his hand. The other 2 boys stumbled as the wall of air hit them, and the goblins riding at their shoulders scrambled to stay mounted. The goblins and their human vehicles were running away in fear. There were 3 unmoving boys surrounding her, along with 1 fairy. Ignoring the boys, Ellie rushed over to Rake. She wasn't sure what had just happened, although a small voice in her mind was whispering to her, "Magic. You did magic." She couldn't quite register that, but she knew she had to check on Rake. She knelt next to the tiny fairy, who had heroically tried to fight off the 5 boys to protect her. He wasn't moving. One of his wings was crumpled and torn. There was a tiny trail of blood at the corner of his mouth. He looked dead, and Ellie felt a surge of rage flow through her. First her brother had been kidnapped by these goblins, and now her new friend had been killed. The combination of intense anger and the feeling of power that still resonated in her took control. The wand felt hot in her hands, eager to be used. She stood and looked around. The forest was noisy. There were violent shouts from teenage boys and screeched orders from goblins directing their soldiers to do more damage and cause more pain. There were screams of fear from fairies and animals. Stood quietly at the edge of it was a 10-year-old girl who was filled with chaotic power that needed a target. Ellie began to walk, a silent glide towards the noisiest parts of the forest, like a ghost with a blank look in her eyes and an emotional numbness directing her movements. When she saw anyone holding a sword, or the small figures of goblins with their sharp features and snide-looking faces, she released the power that was building in her. It would burst forth in unpredictable ways. Lightning bolts, powerful balls of air, small, intense whirlwinds, even burning fireballs. Some tried to attack her, to fight back, but they never got close. Soon there were no more enemies, just scared boys and goblins fleeing for their lives, and shocked fairies staring at her incredulously. Ellie collapsed in grief and exhaustion. Duncan followed the group, with Finn and Charlie close behind. They were trailed by some fearsome-looking boys, men really, by the look of them, although the scars and grime made it difficult to tell. There was a goblin with one of them, giving orders. Those orders seemed to be to head towards the tallest trees in the forest, which could be glimpsed occasionally through the foliage above, and destroy anything of interest along the way. Apparently there would be rewards for any boys who managed to kill a fairy, so there were armed boys that mindlessly hacked at plants and trees along the way, and when some fairies eventually came into view there was a flurry of arrows being launched towards the tiny winged creatures, which seemed to dart out of the way easily. As their troop progressed towards the grove of enormous trees that rose far above the rest of the forest, fairies appeared to become more desperate. They seemed to have magic of their own, for the trees that the fairies touched began to attack the boys. Branches would swing down to swipe at them. Vines would creep along the forest floor in an attempt to entangle the boys' ankles. The branches were slow-moving, but there were many of them, and sometimes they caught a boy. The sound of thick tree branches smashing into the ribs of a boy just a few strides in front of Duncan was sickening. The horrifying screams of another boy could be heard further ahead, as he was dragged into bushes which also attacked the boy. Duncan was terrified and exhausted, and it was taking all of his concentration to avoid death, leaving no chance to look for escape opportunities. Even he wanted to kill the fairies, to stop this cruel attack on him and his friends. As the fairies seemed to become more desperate to stop them, they became more reckless, and some of the boys earned their rewards by batting those tiny bodies with whatever weapon they had to hand. They reached their destination. There were already dozens, maybe even hundreds of soldier boys here. They followed the orders of a number of goblins that strolled around them. Here there were more of the tiny fairy bodies littering the ground. They had tried to defend this place and they had failed. There was still some fighting at the edges, but the goblins and their brainwashed soldiers were in control. The goblin behind Duncan called out orders to look for bags of tooth dust, whatever that was. The group split up, going in different directions. This is it, Duncan realised. Our chance to escape. All they had to do was search somewhere that no goblins could see them, then sneak away. With a signal to Charlie and Finn to follow him, he began to move away, in a direction that looked quiet. But there were more soldiers and goblins arriving every minute, and finding somewhere suitable to make their break was becoming difficult. Then it all began to change. The general air of confidence and victory was disrupted by a ripple of uncertainty. Thunderclaps could be heard shuddering through the forest, but there were no clouds. Then screams could be heard, human screams of fear getting closer. Figures began bursting into the area, running scared and shouting of a demon coming, summoned by the fairies. They were talking fast, screaming words that were barely understandable. They seemed to be claiming that the demon controlled lightning and fire and was coming for them. All of them. The ripple of fear was spreading. It spread to Duncan too, who was already the most scared he had ever been in his life. The screams got closer and the goblins in the area were beginning to look nervous too. The demon arrived. Boys were thrown across Duncan's view by bolts of lightning. Tongues of flame burst forth and several boys and even a goblin ran in panicked circles with clothes on fire. Duncan caught a view of the demon through the trees, although from where he stood it looked more like a skinny girl, considerably smaller than himself. But the whirlwind that seemed to form at her hand and speed towards a group of soldier boys before sending them flying into the air to be slammed into tree trunks, that seemed all too real and demonic. With that, several goblins shouted orders to grab any dust available and retreat back to the portals. It had an instant effect. Every boy began running at full sprint away from the demon. Duncan, driven purely by fear of the demon that would no doubt kill him long before he had a chance to explain that he was not on the goblin's side, ran too. Charlie and Finn dashed along with him. The demon pursued them. Lightning reached out with intense white fingers of death to kill more boys around him, but there were so many boys that surely the demon couldn't get them all. They ran past the trees and plants that were still trying to kill them, and still succeeding occasionally. Suddenly Duncan hit the ground, but didn't stay there as a vine wrapped around his leg and began to drag him to certain doom. Finn quickly grabbed one of Duncan's outstretched hands, slowing the journey towards a thorny bush and giving Charlie enough time to swing his blade clumsily at the vine. He clipped the vine, making it loosen its grip on Duncan and stop dragging, but it hadn't let go, so Charlie hacked at it again. This time he cut all the way through and Duncan was free. In that moment, from behind Charlie, Duncan saw a large tree branch sway towards them. With time for nothing else, Duncan grabbed Charlie's ankles and pulled hard, dropping Charlie to the ground and knocking the air from his lungs. The tree branch narrowly missed them all. They were all alive, for the moment, thanks to each other's efforts. There was no time for gratitude. There were more plants trying to kill them and the demon was still coming. They helped each other to their feet and began running again, following the stream of fearful boys and goblins that fled towards the relative safety of the portals that would take them back to Goblin lands and away from the demon that was hunting them. At last a portal came into view. Duncan could see boys leaping through portals, most going towards the closest ones. He couldn't remember which had been the one that he had come through, but he knew he didn't want to go through the same one as everyone else. He led Finn and Charlie past a portal, then past another and another until he reached one that seemed to be the last. While he could no longer hear screams of death, he was scared that the demon might still be coming. He didn't want to try to reason with a demon, so he took a deep breath and leapt through the portal, with his companions following close behind.